Thank you, Bill. Good morning to you all. It's wonderful to see so many people in a bigger room, much bigger room than the first two meetings we had. And it's an honor for me to do the kickoff of this third edition of the Summer Institute of Theology and Disability. As some of you might know, that over the last decades we have seen a growing interest in the relation between theology and disability that suggests that we are witnessing the emergence of a new field. One of the particularly important landmarks certainly was the publication of The Disabled God by the late Nancy Iceland in 1994. Which inspired people interested in this emerging field to come together in conferences and form new academic platforms for the exchange of ideas. A few examples are the establishment of the European Society for the Study of Theology and Disability, a special research group in the American Academy of Religion on Theology and Disability, and last but not least, also this Summer Institute that today starts its third consecutive year is part of that same picture. However, it seems to me that the clearest sign that we are witnessing something new in the field of theology is the publication of a number of very interesting and innovative books. There is a significant number of publications by people who actually in this room and are part of this week's program, and I will skip my listing of most of their work, not to give my time away to them instead of what I have to say to you right now, but it's in the text, and if this text gets somewhere on some sort of a website, you find all the resources. It's probably not by accident that the authors of these books have been part of previous editions of the Summer Institute and also will be part of this one. And when we look at the program ahead of us, it's surely promising to be an interesting week. In order to get started by what I would like to present to you this morning, let me first make a straightforward observation with regard to that literature. It regards the absence of the doctrine of creation. As far as I can see, the notion of creation has typically not filled many pages in theological texts on disability. As to why that is, one may surmise that from the perspective of creation, disability, like disease and disaster, raises issues about the goodness of creation. Disability appears as that part of human experience that somehow needs to be overcome by God's promises for humankind. And many of the arguments seeks to prove that people with disabilities are included in these promises. But this doesn't alter the fact that much of our theology so far at least implicitly assumes that disability experience is what people want to get away from. Consequently, to make their inclusive arguments work, theologians tend, and this includes myself as well, theologians tend to invoke doctrines that are related to the figure of Christ and his work, such as the doctrine of incarnation, redemption, or eschatology. In drawing attention to this fact, the question arises that I want to reflect upon this morning, which is whether disability experience does not at least potentially contribute to the goodness of life, so that theologies of disability indeed can accord with the account in Genesis saying that when God observed the work of his creation, he saw that it was good. In what follows, I therefore want to flesh out what a theology of creation should enable us to do in thinking about disability. And indeed, in order to do this in an accessible way, after all, it's only 9:30 in the morning, let me tell you a story about Stephen. I learned this story from reading a direct observation report on support work in the group home where Stephen lives. There were three parts in the report in which Stephen occurred. The first was introductory, who is Stephen? And then there were two scenes, one about a conversation between two support staff members and Stephen together with a third client. And the third was an observation about the session of Stephen with his musical therapist. So first part, on introducing Stephen. Support staff members interviewed by the Observer, who wrote this report, tell us that Stephen is a difficult man with a dual diagnosis, which in his case means an intellectual disability combined with schizophrenia. This condition can cause severe behavioral problems, according to his support staff, particularly when Stephen feels he is misunderstood. A particular feature of Stephen's behavior is that he has no clue of what we all know as our personal space, the kind of space that you cannot intrude upon without being threatening to people. So when Stephen is anxious that his support staff doesn't understand what he wants from them, he will go and stand up right up front before the other person, only inches away from their faces, raises his finger and state quite forcefully his demands. Second part. Two of his support staff members are having a coffee with Stephen and another client. The Observer is also present. One support staff member begins to talk to the Observer about Stephen and tells in his particular way of demanding attention. So tells about the finger and the face right in front of him. And listening to this, Stephen gets annoyed and becomes very agitated, whereupon the other support staff member begins to correct him. "We are only explaining that we do not want to see that finger of yours," she says. Within minutes, the whole scene deteriorates into a very negative atmosphere, ending with the fact that Stephen is sent off to his room to cool down. Third part. Stephen sits on the couch with a guitar on his lap. With him is a young woman, also a guitar on her lap, and she turns out to be his musical therapist. "Stephen, what are we going to play?" she asks him. He murmurs something that the Observer doesn't get, but the therapist says, "Okay, we can do that." Then there is some sort of sign Stephen makes with his head, and they begin to play. Apparently something they have found out together as a way for Stephen to indicate when to begin. Then they start to play a tune to which the woman sings. What then happens is that the woman carefully listens to Stephen's guitar and slows down and speeds up in order to make sure that he retains the lead in the song. Now, reading these two observations together with various other people from the group home, I noticed there were two completely different characters in these two scenes, and all agreed. And then I asked them for comments on the two scenes, and what one would assume indeed happened. All comments came down on the two support staff members who completely ruined what could have been an enjoyable coffee break by making some very fundamental mistakes, as the people argued to me. So first, support staff should never talk about people in their presence to third parties, and they certainly should not deny Stephen the means of attracting their attention by raising his finger. "So what do you recommend?" I asked them. Well, expressed in various terms, all the answers came down to the same. Support staff in Stephen's group home are evidently in need of a course of positive behavioral support. I suggested that might be a very good idea, but then I asked them the following question. What if we stopped looking at Stephen as a difficult client and instead henceforth regard him as a musician? One of the people in the conversation was Yuri, himself a man with an intellectual disability, and Yuri was thrilled by the idea. Then he could come and play at my birthday party. I responded that this was an excellent suggestion and asked him, Yuri, how many clients has this organization? About 300. That means about 6 performances every week for Steven. Even more thrilled, Yuri immediately saw a new opportunity. He could earn himself quite a bit of money as a musician. The response to this remark was one of general surprise. How different a perspective was opened by leaving behind the notion of the person with a disability as a person with some kind of a problem to be solved. It appears to me that the difference between the two responses is indicative of of 2 very different ways of understanding support for persons with disabilities. One is directly related to the way in which our society seeks to improve upon the quality of services by insisting on values like respect and dignity for individual people receiving support. What we do typically in these settings is to try to make things better within a given institutional arrangement. But the other way of understanding support introduces a very different paradigm, which centers upon the notion of a good life. This notion leads to different questions that are not necessarily framed by the logic of existing practices and institutions, but that seek to identify the potential that each individual has to become a flourishing human being. Framed theologically, the difference is that the first response seeks to include people with disabilities in the promise of redemption, while the other seeks to discover the goodness of creation in order to aspire to the good life for individual human beings. I have brought up this story about Stephen as indicating, therefore, a different way of thinking theologically about disability. To explain this a bit further, I have to unpack what is a deceptively simple notion, namely the notion of a good life. Given the subjectivist overtones of our present culture, the notion of a good life may be understood initially as the kind of life that people are happy to live because it makes them feel good. This is, however, a deceptive understanding because it is clearly the case that many people are happy with their lives simply because they cannot imagine leading a different one. We know, as a matter of fact, that this is particularly true of many people with disabilities who live their lives without the option of exploring their talents and gifts for leading a life that is very different from the ones they are presently leading. Being satisfied, in other words, is a very unreliable indicator of people's quality of life. The reason is that people with disabilities are often socialized in a cultural climate of low expectations, such they have little experience to explore their own potential. This cultural condition generates the possibility that people with disabilities can be quite content with the kind of life they are currently living, simply because they have no clue of any alternatives. And the same may be true, actually, for their support workers as well, who also often fail to conceive of a different life for their clients, given the framework of existing practices within which they have to operate. Against the subjectivist account, I would argue that the good life is a life within which people are enabled to discover and develop their own potential. In other words, the good life is not an end state, but it is a journey. For any human being, this means a particular environment that is conducive to the end of personal development. It doesn't follow that for any human being the ends to be pursued must be the same. Since the task of each and everyone is to make the most of his or her life, this includes looking at disability experience together with the person involved. In other words, the task lies in discovering what it is for them to become a flourishing human being. Now, when you do that, try to assess disability experience with the person involved. One of the things that they will tell you is that what is most important to them is that they don't have a friend. People want friendship. Now, isn't it curious then that we continue to design human services as if we didn't know this? Liberal society, I venture to say, has invented rights and choice to plug the hole that the lack of friendship in the lives of people with disabilities has left behind. To open up the space for a theology of creation, let me then try and indicate how friendship may provide us with an important clue of how to proceed. First, we may think about creation to get started in terms of ecology, because the ecological approach helps us to see an important point about the human condition, which is about growth. Given the quality of being God's creature, every human being has an environment in which it can flourish and develop into something beautiful. Human beings in this respect are just like flowers. When you put them in the right soil with the right kind of minerals, the right level of humidity, and the right dose of sunlight, you will be surprised to see how they blossom. And this is true for every human being, whatever his or her disabilities or abilities. Each and every one of us has a natural environment where we can flourish. It may be our family, but it need not be, because what makes us flourishing, most of all, is that we are chosen by someone. This, it seems to me, is part of our human nature. Human flourishing is about being the apple in someone else's eye. To illuminate the idea, and let me therefore finish with the story of Larry. I have used this story before. Someone was clever enough to point out to me that it's probably already on one of Bill's tapes, but I couldn't resist the temptation to use it again in a slightly different context. So here is the story of Larry. Larry is a man with all sorts of limitations and problems, not the least of which is that he tends to scream with his high-pitched voice in such a way that you would rather not want to be around him if you had a choice. Because of his screaming, therefore, people tend to avoid his company. Larry, however, very much likes company. So the more people avoid him, the louder he screams. The earlier distinction between two ways of understanding support also works here. On the first, the question will be how we can decrease the level of Larry's screaming in a way that is both respectful and dignified. It is the way that understands the question from the perspective of existing practices, and it seeks to improve upon their quality by infusing them with what our society thinks are important moral values. But the second way of understanding support I indicated enables us to raise very different questions. Questions that invite us to discover, and that is a very important term in this connection, to discover what life's goodness could possibly mean for someone like Larry. And in the present case, this question translates into this. What is it that makes Larry's screaming into a gift? And this is surely an unusual question. What is it that makes Larry's screaming into a gift? The ecological rephrasing of this question would be to ask, what is the kind of environment such that Larry's screaming may be just what is needed to make him flourish? Well, let's think for a moment. Apart from a roller coaster, a pop concert, both of which might be a bit too challenging for Larry, what about the ballpark? What would happen if somebody would come to Larry and say, "Hey Larry, I would very much like you to join me for a ball game. Would you like to come?" What if someone came and expressed a liking for being with Larry rather than seeking a respectful way to make him keep his silence? In the actual case, Larry went to support a senior men's volleyball team in his hometown. They took him in, screaming and all, as their #1 fan, which made him a lot of friends, of course. And the fun part of it was, when they were either practicing, playing a lousy game, or winning, Larry would scream every way because he wouldn't know the difference. And unsurprisingly, as an unsolicited side effect, after a while, Larry stopped screaming at home. In the ecological approach, there are just plants, different plants, and there are no weeds. There are just different plants doing different things in different environments. And this perspective opens up the space for thinking disability experience in terms of God's creation. No weeds, only plants that do well when you manage to match their potential with their environment. That is, ladies and gentlemen, how we grow and flourish. Because human beings are just like that, like plants. Every one of us has a right place with the right people and the right kind of activities in order to become a flourishing human being. So what I've been trying to do this morning is to suggest that if we overcome views that basically regard disability as on par with disaster and disease, we need to get away from theological accounts that understand disability experience as something in need of redemption. When not in this life, then at least in the life hereafter. To introduce the theological perspective of creation may help us to do exactly that which is needed, which is, to use a phrase by Amy Julia Becker, to understand disability as a good and perfect gift. Thank you.